Welcome to episode 42 of What Happens Next. We're really honoured to be talking this week to Jane Thomas because I think often when we're thinking about the next chapter of our lives, we're really leaning in to doing stuff we enjoy more. But how do we work out what we enjoy and how do we work out what motivates us, what gets us up in the morning? And Jane, who's had a really diverse and varied career, now helps people do that. She helps people really work out what motivates them so she can support them with the next chapter of their lives. There's an emphasis when Jane talks on well-being and making sure that we are motivated to get rid of and avoid some of the elements that we can creep upon us when we haven't got purpose and meaning in our lives, such as poor mental health, anxiety and depression. Jane talks about her background in nursing as well as being an expert in mental health and well-being, and talks about Motivational Maps, the online tools that she uses to start a conversation about what happens next in your life. So, without further ado, let's move on to the interview with Jane. Hi, and welcome to this interview for What Happens Next. As you probably know, if you've watched some of these interviews before, I'm your host, Chris Dames, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Jane Thomas, because we're going to be talking about motivation and the fact that when we're thinking about that next chapter in our lives, sometimes we've been thinking about purpose through work, but that might be changing as we evolve into whatever happens next for you. I'm trying to work out what's next. Might mean going back to what actually gets us out of bed in the morning. So I'm trying to work that out myself. So actually, Jane's going to be helping us by sharing some ideas, sharing a framework that helps us work out what those motivations might be, and go from there. Jane, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you today? Obviously on form.
I'm doing well. I cycled into work, which is always a good start, but it does mean that I'm running a bit late, and I've done my exercises, and I'm off for a curry with friends tonight, so I'm looking forward to that as well.
Very nice, very nice.
Now, I know what you do, and I understand how it might help people navigate in what happens next. For the benefit of our viewers, our audience, tell us a bit about you.
All right, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I'm Jane Thomas, and I am director of Premier Life Skills. My career path started at Southampton University Hospital, where I trained as a nurse, and then I moved down to Poole Hospital in Dorset and worked in a very large intensive coronary care unit. I guess that was my first sort of experience of working with people and teams and being in the sort of the senior sort of leadership sort of role in that department. And I guess you see so many different characters, don't you? And you see so many different things, and especially in that type of environment as well. And then I actually moved over solely into cardiology, and I was the cardiac sister, and then set up with a colleague something called cardiac rehabilitation. So very much about educating people sort of post cardiac event. The problem with that, of course, is that it was very late on in the day, basically. We wanted to look at prevention. How do we stop these people actually coming into the coronary care unit? But of course, that was never going to happen. We weren't part of that. We weren't part of that primary, sort of healthcare team. So I guess I got to the stage in my career where I was sort of a bit of a clinical ceiling, and where do I go next? And there wasn't really an awful lot, a place for me to go in one sense. Or do I go into senior management? And I think because of my clinical background, that would have been probably quite challenging because
Yeah.
of the decisions that were being made that I didn't always feel were necessarily the best decisions for patients. But what I was very aware of, Chris, is that we didn't really have very effective sort of systems in place around leadership, performance management, absence management. You know, we were hemorrhaging money. And so I actually went to my director and I put a proposal to her and said, look, you know, for me, well-being, leadership, all of those things that I've just talked about, they're a little bit like, you know, the hub of a bike, as you know, all right? And if the spokes on your wheel, you know, were bent or not there, you know, it's going to affect the rim, it'll affect the tire, and probably you'll fall off. And I guess my analogy is we were falling off. So I went away and I actually trained in all of those particular aspects. And then she actually sold me to other directors. And that's when I got my love for training. That's where I got my love for developing, you know, team building. We talked a lot about well-being management. We did a lot about absenteeism, performance management. And so from that, then it seemed a natural progression to start my own company, which is Premier Life Skills Limited.
So when was that?
And sorry,
When was that?
it was around about 14 years ago. About 14
Okay.
years ago. And that's where I am today, basically.
Love it. Talk to me a bit about, you know what I'm curious about? Because one of the things that we talk about quite a lot on What Happens Next is physical well-being and the importance of, particularly when we are sort of navigating the next stage of our life, thinking about not only well-being in terms of money, but also having the physical capability to do stuff.
Mm.
And it's interesting the point you made about prevention and cure. What would you say the things that we should look at to make sure we're living physically healthier lives? What do we ignore, and what did you see in your life as a nurse?
Um, I think what was really fascinating, Chris, is that in the clinical environment, a lot of, not all doctors, but a lot of doctors and clinical people only look at that particular aspect of it.
Yeah.
So, for
What's the
instance,
disease, right? What's the disease? Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it's just the heart. So if we're going to take the heart, which was my speciality, you know, it was, you know, what's wrong with it? What's right with it? How do we make it better? And I was really fortunate that my cardiologist at the time was very much more interested in the whole holistic picture.
Yeah.
And actually, we were really fortunate to go work with a professor in Edinburgh who had already started to link anxiety and depression to a physical illness. But of course, the clinicians who were looking after those patients, in one sense, just pushed that aside. They weren't willing to maybe what else is going on here. You know, we all know that we need to exercise, eat 5 portions of fruit and veg a day. You know, get enough sleep. You know, think positively. But what happens if that isn't happening? And is there a medical connotation that could happen because we're not doing that bit at the beginning? And I guess
Yeah.
that's what I was seeing, Chris. You know, people who had not looked after themselves in many different ways, whether that was physically or mentally, and the end result was, you know, sort of this cardiac event. And the hard thing was trying to get the clinicians to understand that and to ask the question, what was going on before all of this?
Yeah.
How can we help people to, you know, think about their welfare and their well-being before they get to the stage of ill health? And I
Yeah.
think that I'm not sure that has. I think it has changed a bit, but I think there's still an awful lot of work to do to get that in place.
I suppose the challenge you've got with anything that relates to the NHS is it's such a big boat,
Mhm.
isn't it? Trying to turn that to look at prevention instead of cure at the point of
Yeah.
disease is a really difficult one, I think. So started off helping out senior leaders in the NHS and working in the NHS. What does Premier Life Skills look like now in terms of the people you help?
Yeah. Okay. So Premier Life Skills, we've got. I call it a couple of arms to the business. So I've used my skill set of working in the NHS, and actually we have a level, what we call a level 5 diploma in mental health and wellbeing awareness. and that is externally accredited by an awarding body. So we're one of the only UK sort of training companies to have an external accreditation. A lot of companies have an internal accreditation or assessment. So ours is by the Counselling and Psychotherapy Central Awarding Body. And that's a course where we train trainers to be competent and go out there and talk about mental health and well-being. Some of them are using it in-house with large organizations, and others are setting up on their own and actually going into businesses and talking to organizations. And other people are using it more for coaching, counseling, these sorts of things. So that's one arm to the business. The second arm is that then we, as a business, as Premier Life Skills, we go into businesses and talk about mental health, well-being, resilience, positive psychology. We look at training managers. We work with staff. We also run what we call well-being risk assessments for companies. So that, again, looking at helping them to identify the best way to work with their staff around their well-being. And then we have another arm to the business, which is what they call train the trainer. So this tends to be a training where, for instance, if you're teaching somebody, say, silver service, you want everybody to do silver service exactly the same. And so therefore that is actually part of what we call train the trainer. And then I guess the golden thread that is now goes right the way through my business is, as you touched on, Chris, already, motivational maps. I became a motivational licensed practitioner I'm just looking at my wall here, in 2013. And I am now one of 5 UK, what we call senior practitioners, work directly with James Sale. He is the creator of Motivational Maps. And we work directly with James Sale. And then what enables me to do within that is also to train to train people to be licensed practitioners as well. So they can then use maps, again, whether that's internally in a business or maybe because they're a coach or, they want to be able to use the motivational maps in their own sort of businesses and companies.
So Jane, you mentioned about the motivational maps being the golden thread. Why is it the golden thread, do you think, to positive mental health and well-being?
Because what we see in the maps, Chris, is that if somebody is their motivators are not being satisfied. So I think it's quite important to point out that somebody might get a map profile. They're done online, and I send them a map code. And it might be that they will say to me, I am motivated, Jane, and I'm surprised that my motivational score is quite low. Other people will say to me, I know I'm not motivated. I know that I'm gone off kilter and I need to get back on track. Yeah. But with the maps, it's not so much whether you are or you're not motivated. And they link into either this really needs action, or these motivators are in risk, or they're in what we call the boost zone, or they're the optimum level. So ideally, we want high boost, optimum level. But the key thing about the maps is that it's whether or not you currently feel your motivators are being satisfied at this moment in time. And linking into well-being, what I see is that if those motivators are not being satisfied, there is a higher prevalence that people's mental well-being isn't being satisfied as well.
Good, yeah.
On the opposite side of that, it's when I see what I call the 100%ers, which people sort of think, wow, this is fantastic. They're 100% motivated. My question often to them is, what do you do to relax? Because they're so driven by what they might be doing. And I guess they confuse it maybe for a love of what they do and being so driven that's the only thing that they do. So it could be that relationships are suffering, or other aspects in their life are not actually.
I really hope you're enjoying the interview so far, but now what I'd like you to do is take action to help you work out what happens next in your life. The easiest way to do that is to do the What Happens Next quiz. It's free to do, takes about 5 minutes, and you can do it while you make a cup of tea and wait for the next part of the interview. You can visit www.whathappensnext.life/quiz. You'll get your results by email immediately. And what the quiz will do is give you an insight into the areas of wellbeing you're doing really well at, but also the areas that you might want to improve. Enjoy the quiz. Let us know what you think, and let's get on with the interview.
Which need to be looked at and not being looked at because they're just so driven by this one thing.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Like, you look at the perception of success and achievement, and sometimes that conversation about, and it's interesting when I have conversations with my clients who have done well financially, have been successful in their career, and get to a point where they go, is this it? When actually those high achievers have always been focused on that element of well-being, which is the work relate, the intellectual and occupational well-being. And often, as you say, they've neglected potentially physical, potentially social, like all of these other areas as part of their lives. What's the right balance, though? What do you think the right balance is? Because, I suppose it depends on the individual, right?
Absolutely, yeah. When somebody has when somebody's actually completed a MAP profile, the first thing that I do is actually spend the minimum of half an hour with them, going through or understanding first of all about them, because at that point, Chris, all I'm seeing is a set of numbers. And what the maps do is they help you to ask those why questions. Yeah. So if it's something like you've just described, why has that been such a focus for you for 30 odd years of your life? It's like when people retire, they've got this ideal plan of what they want to do, and then it doesn't necessarily materialize. And then that's where I also see it affecting their welfare and their well-being. And what
the challenge
yes,
I suppose the challenge you've got is that element of, how do you replace that motivation in that next chapter of your life if you're not getting it through work, right?
Yes. Yeah. And especially if they've been right up there in that optimal, 90%, 100%er, and they've been driven by that so much. So it's very subjective, because it depends on the story, I guess, that they tell me. It depends on why they're doing a motivational map. And that could be because they had this feeling, I guess, that something's not right.
Yeah.
But some people will be very clear about what's not right, and other people are not so clear about it. And so either the map sort of reaffirms where they are at. I mean, I was speaking with somebody yesterday, and they said, the map wasn't any surprise to me. In fact, it helped me to think I am on the right track. But it also does the opposite. When somebody's not on the right track, it enables them to get back on that right track, whatever that might be, for the next sort of stage in their life, basically.
One thing I'm really curious about is how much, in your experience, when you're working with people and they've got this motivational map as a way to frame the way that to understand what gets them out of the bed in the morning, how much of the change that they think they need to make is internal, the stories they tell themselves about what they do and how they do it, and how much tends to be external? Because I'd imagine, like, if you're doing a job that's completely unaligned to your what gets you out in the bed in the morning, you probably need to make external change. But most of us are somewhere in the middle, right? Most of us have got autonomy, but we might want to reframe what we do, and that's an inner game, isn't it? So how much of the change they need to make is external, and how much is internal?
I mean, I guess you've got to look at what are internal motivators and external motivators. So an external might be money. So the builder links into that within the map profile. So they've been very driven by achieving what they want to achieve, because they want to provide whatever that might be, for whether that's material things for their family, or they want to travel, or whatever they do. So their main driver, earn as much as I can to then enable me to have that intrinsic motivation, a purpose in what I want to do. So
Yeah.
there's none of somebody will have much more. So I tend to find that people who are in the caring profession tend to have more intrinsic motivation. They're driven by wanting to help people. They want to make a difference with people. And
Yeah.
then if I look at sort of sales teams, often they are much more driven by, say, the builder motivator, which is, sell more, earn more. Now, there's
Right.
nothing wrong with either of that. It's if it satisfies you. What I see often, Chris, which I find very interesting with the maps, is that people who've got what we call, there are clusters, and I'll go into those in a minute. But if we say people who've got, say, a high defender motivator, and the defender motivator is all about security, predictability, stability. So they would often rather stay in a job and be unhappy than make the change to go and do something different. And that's that bit then where the map helps them, I guess, to think, how I can't, if your motivational score is, say, only 30% out of 100, this, if you don't make those changes, what's going to be the consequences of
Yeah.
this?
Yeah.
And it's proposing it to them. It's not saying this will happen, you need to do that, or it's have a think about it. What, by not doing that, and that again might be where a high motivator is hindering them making those particular decisions.
Gotcha. How do you find motivation changes throughout life? Because I'd imagine, like, if I look at my life, probably my 20s, 30s, as we were building the business, my motivation was, look, I promised Cassie and Charlotte that I'd make this a success. And as you know, because I've just done my motivational map, I'm probably more looking to add value in the world and looking to find purpose and looking to find meaning. But I don't know whether I'd be there if I hadn't done that bit.
Yeah.
So how did motivational maps in your experience evolve? And what I'm curious about is, how have your motivations changed?
Yeah, our motivators change. So motivational maps are not like a psychometric profile. So a psychometric profile, doesn't really change an awful lot, which is much more about our personality trait. So it's a little bit about personality in the maps. But yeah, I mean, I always recommend to people that they have a map done every year. So it's a little bit like your own health check, your own motivational health check. And some people's motivators will really change. So those then need to be accommodated. So if you happen to be a manager of people, your natural tendency is to keep managing that person in the same way that you did the year before. If you then look at their map profile, as you say, you've changed through your life and your direction has changed and your motivation has changed. And so therefore it's looking at what is current for you now. Where do you need that energy to go? Motivation is all about energy. So are we putting our energy into the right things in our life?
Yeah.
And is there a battle in one sense with what motivates us and drives us, but where we are realistically? And that again is where sort of the coaching side of it will come in. So for instance, if you've got a manager who's got what we call a high friend motivator. So friends, they want to belong. All right, they want to belong. They want to be part of a team. They want very collaborative working environments. They don't want to go into an environment which makes them feel uncomfortable. Not a problem. But say that's your top motivator as a manager, and your lowest motivator is director, which is about making sure that things are done correctly, being in charge of things, leading things, leading people, leading that team. So as I think you can see here, Chris, we might have some issues here. We might not, but what happens when that manager has got to performance manage?
Yeah.
It feels very, very uncomfortable for them. So sometimes what we have to think about when I look at a profile is, ideally, should those motivators be higher in that profile? And are there, because of where they're sitting currently, does that actually cause a problem for that particular individual?
You know what's interesting, and this is the interesting thing. I think in larger organisations that might work, but if you're running like you and I running a SME business, you've got to sometimes wear 10 different hats, right? And
Yeah.
yes, it's about building the team to make sure that you're putting on less hats and doing the ones you enjoy. And we're certainly trying to do that at Velo. But part of that is like sometimes you've got to put on the boss hat, even though you're not a natural director. What do you do about that? How do you make that journey easier if you're not naturally motivated in that direction?
Yeah. I think that with a lot of people, there is a lot of people are aware that maybe that isn't something that really motivates or drives them. But then I think it's very much talking through, what does this business need? If it's a
Yeah.
very small business, it may be that you don't need a lot of a direction. In fact, it may be that it's a very sort of flat sort of organization that you work in. And in fact, maybe the senior person, that's not their role to make, to be in charge. But the next level down, it might very much be. And
Yeah.
so it's again, it's very much matching, because what you can also do, Chris, is you have individual maps, and then you can put a team map profile together. And when you put the team map profile together, you possibly see more of the gaps.
Yeah.
And then what I then do is I work with the team to have a look at how do we fill these gaps? What is it that's needed? I was working with a recruitment company last week in Scotland, and they're all what we call very high growth motivators. All right, so they want to get on with it, they want to be quick, and they're very visionary. They come up with loads and loads of ideas, but nobody checks it. Nobody's checking what's going on. The relationship clusters are what I call the checkers. And so they were so driven that, they'd be at a meeting, and they weren't short of ideas, but nobody followed it through.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
nobody was checking that it was following it through. Now, ideally, that's not natural for them to do the check-in. So with that situation, what I was saying to them is that one of you've got to take responsibility. It can be different people at different meetings, but somebody's got to take responsibility to follow it all through. Otherwise, nothing gets done. And
Or
that's what was
bring
then.
somebody in who's good at ops,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. And that's what was really frustrating the director, because although they come up with these ideas, nothing carried on after that. And when I put up, it's called the 5 elements model, and it shows where your motivators fit in with it. And when I put it up, they all smiled and went, "Oh gosh, okay, yeah, we can see now." And that's what the maps do. It just brings
Yeah.
things that are
Yeah. It's a
invisible.
mirror, isn't it? It's a
Absolutely,
mirror.
yeah, and just opens it up. Opens it up so people can see that and that's what the maps do. They make things that are invisible visible.
So help me understand then. So this channel, what happens next, and this project is all about helping people at that crossroads think about what they might want to do next,
Mhm.
particularly if they're making drastic changes to career and life in their 50s and 60s. That's what we're about. And if you've got a story about this, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
How do we potentially use motivational maps to hold up that mirror about
Mhm.
what we might want to do next?
Yeah. So thank you for asking that, Chris, because I had somebody asked me to see a lady who happened to be a deputy head teacher. And she had been diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and was signed off sick. And I was asked to do a map on her, because I knew her husband, and he was, as you can imagine, extremely concerned about her. Now, when she came to see me, she predisposed with anxiety and depression. So if she sat in front of a general practitioner, you could understand why.
Yeah.
She was tearful, she was emotional, but what was really interesting, Chris, is that when she did her map profile, her percentage score out of 100 was 66%. So when I'm looking at her, I can see why clinically, and understand why she was feeling like she was feeling. But I'm looking at this sheet of paper thinking, she's 66% motivated. What's going on here? So this is where the questions start. And she told me that, she the anxiety starts when she goes to a head teacher's meeting, because the head teacher keeps saying, "This is going to be your new head one day." She'd gone off and done the head teacher's training, and her words to me were, "I hated every minute of it, Jane. I knew this is not what I wanted to do." And so the panic attack, the fight and flight response that kicks in, was starting originally, say, a couple of hours before the meeting. Then it started to be a couple of days. And then it was just completely taking over her life. But what she told me, Chris, is that she said, I've looked at other jobs. I've looked at, maybe I'll go work in a retail store or whatever. But she said, "Jane, it's not in my heart. I know what I want to do, but I also know what I don't want to do." And I said, "There's your answer."
Yeah, yeah.
And so, we started to talk. Because her motivational score was 66%, I was able to ask, questions that possibly I wouldn't have asked at that stage. So with the maps, it gives me a picture of what's happening and gives me some really good information to ask those questions before I see that person. And at the end of it, and at the end of that hour, she basically said to me, "I know what I've got to do." And she was going to actually take the whole of the term off school to just try and find herself, understand what she needed, what she required. And she said, "I've got to go home. I've got to tell my family I do not want to be a head teacher. I've got to tell my head teacher and the governors that's not what I want to be." And she was back in school within 2 weeks,
Yeah,
and the panic attack stopped.
yeah.
And then we looked at, in the next session, we looked at what actually does she want to do. And again, her friend motivator, was up there, a belonging, her searcher motivator, making a difference. She wanted to provide something that's worthwhile. And her idea was actually to become a mentor of new teachers in the profession. And that's what she did. And now that's what she does now. She goes out and she works with new teachers in different schools. And that was
I,
one session, Chris, that we found all of that out.
I love that. And the interesting thing about that is that expectation of the sort of straight line career, when people would turn around and go, well, because they're good at that job, they'd be brilliant at
Yeah.
that job, when actually the skills, attributes, and motivations are going to be fundamentally different for those two roles, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, what do you think we need to change about the conversations we have about the world of work when we're thinking about these sort of motivations?
Um, Sorry, repeat that again, Chris. What did you?
So,
You-
if we particularly in bigger organisations, if we think about work as this path that
yeah.
this job leads to that job, leads to that job, leads to that job, what do we need to change about that context? Let's take your lady as an example. The next job is this one. When she's going, hold on, no, I don't want to. What do we need to change about the conversations we have about the world of work in that regard?
I think, Chris, I think it's. I guess it's a bit of the culture, isn't it, of the organisation? It was like in my nursing, life. There was a stepping stone that you went up, and I think that, for people who've been in the profession a long time, that stepping stone then was to be, say, the ward sister. Yet they might not have really wanted to do that. And then you've got to question, will they make a very good ward sister? In fact, they'll probably be better staying where they are, but developing in a different way. So I think we have to think about people as individuals, and I'm not sure
Yeah,
that large organisations often do that. That's where I think, and certainly in a lot of public sector organisations, and what I see, people are staying there because they don't know where else to go. And then that really starts to affect their welfare and well-being. But if they're a manager in that organization, the manager starts to affect other people's welfare and well-being,
yeah,
because they're not in the role that really drives them and really motivates them, but they don't know where to go either. And
yeah.
that again is where I see a lot of people like that, where we sit down and we start to explore, not so much of being we've got to be realistic here. But where do you see the next sort of 2 to 3 years? What's the planning? What do you want to do now? And nothing wrong for somebody to say, do you know what? I want to retire here. I'm more than happy to stay in this organization. But also we've got to be happy for people to move on. And I think what I'm seeing, Chris, which is very interesting in a lot of organizations, is that the generation of people who are in their sort of early 20s, probably even going into their 30s, they don't stay in a job for often for more than about 2 years.
Yeah.
And that again can be very healthy for them. But then if they feel peer support from other people, I should move on now, when actually I'm quite comfortable in this environment, and I'm motivated in this environment. So it very much, I think, depends on the individual, doesn't it?
There's a definite generational shift away from that, like job for life, that probably happened one generation ago to guys in their 20s now who go, well, hold on, what? Actually, my well-being is more important, and I should focus on sort of, and I suppose the challenge you've got as business owners is how do you motivate, encourage, and attract the people you need for your business, which is like an interesting challenge, and it's fundamentally different to the way it was a few years ago. Just very quickly, just a summary, because I know you talked about the 12 motivators earlier, and this interview's gone so well and so quickly, Jane. We've almost run out of time, so I want to make sure that we cover up the 12 motivators. So, can you give me the 12 motivators and just a summary of what they might mean?
So there are nine. There are nine motivators. Nine, and they sit in what we call 3 cluster groups. So there is what we call the relationship motivators, which are friends. So as I've just said, friends like to belong. They like to be part of the team. There is the star motivator. They like recognition. They like respect. And then there's the defender motivator, and they seek security, predictability, and stability. And they all sit in what we call a relationship cluster. Now, we also have to remember, we've all got these 9 motivators somewhere, Chris. However, they may be a little bit lower down your profile, and nothing wrong with that at all. But again, you've got to ask those questions. Should they be a little bit higher, or are you missing out on relationships because your motivators are further, your relationship motivators are further down down your map profile? Then we have what we call the achievement motivators, all right, and they are experts. So experts love to learn, they like to develop. Then you've got the director. So again, you've got influence, power, control, and then you've got the builder, and they're the money, the materialistic satisfaction motivators, and they're very much in what we call this present perspective. So what do I need to do now? So that logical head thinking, that timely decision making, very practical, give me the data, the facts, the evidence. So what I find sometimes with those clusters, they can get a little bit stuck and paralyzed because all they want is data constantly, but not necessarily moving it on.
Yeah.
And then the last batch of motivators are what we call the growth motivators. So they're much more futuristic. Where will I be in 5 years' time? They have no problem with change. They like to be in roles where there's a lot of change and a lot of different things for them to be doing. And these motivators are searcher. So the searcher they like to provide something that's worthwhile, and like to make a difference. Then you've got the creator. So they like to be innovative, creative, problem solving. And then we've got the spirit, and the spirit likes freedom. They like autonomy. They want to make their own decisions. And the growth motivators really do not like being micromanaged. So, if you can see very quickly that if that's happening with you in an organization, you feel that you're being very much micromanaged, then the higher probability is you will go and search for something else. And that, again, is where I guess the maps help organizations to keep people. We know we've got a huge recruiting problem, nationally. And so how do we keep our staff in that work environment and make sure they're satisfied? And how do we do that if we don't even know what motivates them? So a lot of my companies now, they'll use maps for recruiting. They will use maps for appraisals, so that every year the individual has a motivational map. They will use them for individual development and coaching. and they can use them for team development and coaching. Often I will work with organizations where there is maybe a disalignment between maybe the senior team or the manager and the team. And what I find with maps, because they're a self-inventory, you're making the assessment. Nobody's making an assessment on you. You're answering the questions. It helps people to open up and helps people to have those healthy discussions about where we are, where we need to be, and how do we get there.
Perfect. Absolutely love that. Jane, if somebody watches this and says, you know what, I need a further conversation with Jane about motivational maps for either me, my team, my organisation at large, where can they find out a bit more about you?
So I have a website, which is www. and that's called premierlifeskills.co.uk. And on there, all the things I've talked about, our different training courses are on there. And there's an information that you can link to and actually contact me. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So on LinkedIn, I'm under the name of Jane, and then in brackets Holsworth, which is HALLSWORTH, Thomas. And there again, you would be able to link to me, send me a message, we can talk, we can understand what you need and what you require and how I might be able to help and support you.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much for your time today. I've loved it.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
I really hope you enjoyed that interview. And I know that podcasts are brilliant because when you're on the go, you can listen wherever you want. However, if you've got a few minutes and like me, you're a bit more of a visual learner, you might want to visit our YouTube channel at What Happens Next Live. There'll be a link in the comments as well so that you can find us. And what I really appreciate you doing, we've got all the interviews on there, all the interviews you're listening to right there on there. But what we've also done is recorded exclusive content specifically for the YouTube channel that you can watch and get more insights into the next stage of your life and navigating it successfully. I'd ask a favour while you're there, if you can, like the videos you like, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us help more people. Thank you. So that was the insights Jane provided about the next chapter of your life and how motivation and understanding your motivation is going to play such an integral and intrinsic part in working out what's next for you. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and we'll see you on the channel soon.